My parents co-signed my cousin's loan. Now that he's bankrupt, they expect me to fix it. So I gave one answer that shut it down. I'm 31 and I've always been the responsible one in my family, while my cousin Brett has been the charming dreamer who could talk his way into anything. Growing up, we were only 2 years apart and spent a lot of time together during family gatherings, but our approaches to life couldn't have been more different. I saved my allowance and worked part-time jobs through high school while Brett spent money as fast as he could get his hands on it and always had some grand scheme brewing. Brett was the kind of person who could convince adults that his latest idea was going to make him rich even when those ideas were obviously unrealistic. He talked about becoming a professional athlete despite being mediocre at sports, then pivoted to wanting to be a famous musician despite never learning to play an instrument properly. My parents and his parents would listen to these dreams with indulgent smiles, while I wondered if anyone else noticed that Brett never actually worked toward his goals. After high school, I went to community college and then transferred to a state university where I studied accounting. I graduated with minimal student loan debt because I'd worked throughout college and lived frugally. Brett, meanwhile, spent 2 years bouncing between different universities before dropping out to pursue what he called entrepreneurial opportunities. His parents supported his decision, saying that traditional education wasn't for everyone and that Brett was too creative for conventional paths. I started my career at a small accounting firm and worked my way up steadily over the years. I bought a modest house, saved consistently for retirement, and built an emergency fund that could cover 6 months of expenses. I wasn't living lavishly, but I was financially secure and proud of what I'd accomplished through careful planning and hard work. Brett's entrepreneurial ventures never seemed to pan out despite his endless enthusiasm and confidence. He tried selling supplements online, opened a food truck that failed within 6 months, and attempted to become a social media influencer without gaining any significant following. Each failure was explained away as bad timing or unfair circumstances, rather than poor planning or execution. But 3 years ago, Brett announced that he'd finally found his calling in real estate investing. He'd been watching YouTube videos and attending seminars about flipping houses and was convinced he could make millions buying distressed properties, fixing them up, and selling them for huge profits. He talked about becoming financially independent within 5 years and retiring early to travel the world. The problem was that Brett had no money to start his real estate empire, and his credit score was terrible from years of financial irresponsibility. He'd maxed out credit cards, defaulted on a car loan, and had several collections accounts that he'd ignored rather than paying off. No legitimate lender would give him the money he needed to buy his first investment property. That's when Brett turned to our family for help with his financing problem. He needed someone with good credit to co-sign a loan for $65,000, which would cover the down payment and initial renovation costs for a house he'd found in a declining neighborhood. He promised it would be a quick flip that would generate enough profit to pay back the loan within 6 months. My parents were initially hesitant because $65,000 was a significant amount of money for them. They weren't wealthy, just middle-class people who'd worked hard and saved carefully for their retirement. But Brett was persistent and persuasive, painting pictures of the financial freedom he'd achieve and the gratitude he'd show to anyone who helped him get started. Brett's parents couldn't co-sign because their own credit had been damaged by previous attempts to help him out of financial trouble. They'd already co-signed for his failed food truck venture and were still paying off debt from that disaster. So Brett focused all his attention on convincing my parents that this opportunity was different and that he'd learned from his previous mistakes. What finally convinced my parents to co-sign was Brett's promise to put the house in their name as collateral for the loan. He said this would protect them completely because even if something went wrong with his business plan, they'd own a piece of real estate that was worth more than the loan amount. He showed them comparable sales in the neighborhood and insisted the property was undervalued. I tried to warn my parents that co-signing any loan for Brett was a terrible idea based on his track record of financial irresponsibility. I pointed out that he'd never successfully completed any business venture and that real estate investing was much more complex than he understood. I offered to review his business plan and help them understand the risks involved. But my parents dismissed my concerns, saying I was being overly cautious and unsupportive of family. They said Brett deserved a chance to prove himself and that sometimes you had to take risks to achieve success. They seemed to believe that Brett's enthusiasm and confidence were more important than his complete lack of relevant experience or financial track record. They signed the co-signer documents in March of last year, with Brett promising to make all payments on time and keep them informed about the progress of his renovation project. He assured them repeatedly that this was going to be the investment that changed his life and that they'd never regret helping him get started in real estate. Brett's real estate venture started going wrong almost immediately, but he was skilled at hiding problems and maintaining optimism even when circumstances were deteriorating rapidly. The house he'd purchased was in worse condition than he'd initially assessed, and the renovation costs quickly spiraled beyond his budget. What he'd estimated as a $15,000 fix-up turned into a $40,000 complete overhaul. The neighborhood Brett had chosen was declining faster than he'd anticipated, with several other properties going into foreclosure and property values dropping rather than increasing as he'd predicted. The comparable sales he'd shown my parents were from before the market softened and were no longer relevant to the current situation. His timeline for a quick flip became completely unrealistic. Brett tried to manage the renovation work himself to save money, but he had no construction experience or project management skills. He hired the cheapest contractors he could find without checking references or verifying their licensing. Several of them did substandard work that had to be redone, while others disappeared with partial payments and never completed their jobs. My parents started getting worried when Brett asked them for additional money just 3 months into the project. He claimed it was just a temporary cash flow issue and that he needed another $10,000 to complete the renovations. He promised the house would be on the market within 6 weeks and that they'd be repaid with interest as soon as it sold. I advised my parents not to give Brett any more money and to demand a detailed accounting of how the original loan funds had been spent. When I reviewed his expenses, it was clear that he'd been wildly irresponsible with money, using loan funds for personal expenses and paying premium prices for work that should have cost much less. He had no business plan, just vague optimism and poor execution. But Brett was convincing in his explanations, claiming that all successful real estate investors faced unexpected challenges and that the additional investment would secure their profits. My parents wanted to believe him because they'd already committed so much money and couldn't bear the thought that their investment might be a total loss. They gave him the additional $10,000 against my strong advice. The project continued to deteriorate as Brett made one poor decision after another. He chose expensive finishes that didn't match the neighborhood's price range, installed features that added cost without adding value, and generally treated the renovation like he was building his dream home rather than creating a marketable investment property. His total spending eventually reached nearly $90,000 on a house he'd bought for $45,000. Meanwhile, Brett wasn't making the loan payments he'd promised to handle personally. My parents started receiving notices from the bank about missed payments and realized that Brett had been lying about his financial situation. When they confronted him, he claimed that his other business ventures were temporarily short on cash, but that everything would be resolved once the house sold. The house finally went on the market after 8 months of renovations, but it was priced too high for the neighborhood and attracted no serious buyers. Brett refused to lower the price, insisting that he needed to recoup his investment and that the right buyer would eventually come along. The property sat empty while carrying costs for utilities, insurance, and loan payments continued accumulating. After 6 months with no offers, Brett finally agreed to reduce the price, but by then the local market had deteriorated further and comparable properties were selling for much less than his break-even point. The house that he'd claimed would generate huge profits was now clearly going to result in a significant loss no matter what price they accepted. My parents were devastated as they realized the scope of the financial disaster they'd been drawn into. The $65,000 loan they'd co-signed had become their responsibility, while the house they'd thought would serve as collateral was worth less than the outstanding debt. They were facing the possibility of losing their retirement savings to cover Brett's irresponsible investment. Brett's response to the failing project was to declare personal bankruptcy, claiming that his debts had become unmanageable and that he needed a fresh start. The bankruptcy would eliminate his personal liability for the house and the loan, leaving my parents completely responsible for the entire debt. He seemed to view this as a reasonable solution that would allow him to move on to his next opportunity. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed that Brett had been living well beyond his means for years, accumulating credit card debt, personal loans, and other obligations while maintaining the appearance of success. He'd been using money from the house renovation project to pay other bills and support a lifestyle he couldn't afford. The real estate investment had just been his latest attempt to solve deeper financial problems. After Brett filed for bankruptcy, my parents were left holding the full responsibility for a $65,000 loan secured by a house that was worth maybe $40,000 in the current market. They were looking at a $25,000 loss plus ongoing carrying costs until they could find a buyer. Their retirement plans were completely derailed by this financial catastrophe. The stress of the situation was taking a serious toll on my parents' health and marriage. My father developed anxiety-related insomnia, while my mother was having panic attacks about their financial future. They'd worked for 35 years to build their retirement savings and now faced the possibility of having to work several more years to recover from Brett's failed investment. Instead of taking responsibility for his role in their financial disaster, Brett seemed to view his bankruptcy as a clean slate that freed him from any obligations to help fix the mess he'd created. He talked about his plans for new business ventures and showed no remorse about the impact his decisions had on my parents' lives. His attitude was that business risks sometimes don't pay off and that everyone involved should just move on. Brett's parents were sympathetic to my parents' situation, but claimed they couldn't provide financial assistance because their own resources were limited. They'd been burned by previous attempts to help Brett and weren't willing to risk more of their own money. They suggested that the best solution would be for other family members to step in and help cover the losses. That's when the pressure campaign directed at me began in earnest. My parents started hinting that I should help them out of their financial predicament since I was doing well professionally and had been conservative with my spending over the years. They pointed out that I had savings and could afford to help family members in need without experiencing real hardship myself. The guilt trips became increasingly direct as my parents emphasized how much they'd sacrificed to help me succeed in life. They reminded me of college expenses they'd covered, orthodontic work they'd paid for, and countless other ways they'd supported my education and development. They seemed to believe that I owed them financial assistance when they were struggling regardless of how they'd gotten into their situation. My aunt and Uncle Brett's parents also started approaching me about helping to resolve the financial crisis. They suggested that I could loan my parents money to cover their losses or even take over the mortgage payments on the investment property. They framed it as a family obligation and seemed genuinely surprised when I wasn't immediately eager to help clean up Brett's mess. The extended family began taking sides, with some relatives supporting the idea that I should help my parents, while others agreed that Brett's problems weren't my responsibility. Family gatherings became tense affairs where the topic of money and obligation dominated every conversation. Several relatives stopped speaking to each other over disagreements about who should bear responsibility for fixing the situation. My parents' expectations became increasingly unrealistic as they calculated exactly how much money I should contribute based on their assessment of my financial capacity. They seemed to have researched my salary and made assumptions about my savings that weren't entirely accurate. They talked about $25,000 like it was pocket change for someone in my profession. When I explained that I had my own financial goals and couldn't afford to absorb their losses, my parents accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. They said that family was supposed to help each other during difficult times and that my refusal to contribute showed a lack of character and appreciation for everything they'd done for me. The pressure intensified when my parents started experiencing real financial consequences from the situation. They had to take equity out of their home to cover the loan payments and were considering returning to work part-time to generate additional income. Watching them struggle was emotionally difficult, but I knew that bailing them out would only enable the pattern of poor decision-making that had created the crisis. Brett remained completely detached from the family drama his bankruptcy had caused, acting like the financial disaster was just an unfortunate coincidence rather than the predictable result of his irresponsible behavior. He seemed genuinely puzzled by my parents' stress and couldn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal about money when there were more important things in life. The situation reached a breaking point when my parents gave me an ultimatum during Sunday dinner. They said I had 2 weeks to decide whether I was going to help them financially or whether I was choosing to let them lose their retirement savings. They made it clear that my decision would permanently affect our relationship and my standing in the family. The family meeting that would determine my future relationship with my parents took place on a Sunday afternoon in their living room. My mother had prepared a detailed presentation showing their financial situation, the losses they were facing, and their calculations of how much I should contribute to resolve the crisis. They'd clearly spent considerable time preparing their case for why I was obligated to help them. My father started the conversation by reviewing the timeline of events from Brett's initial loan request through his bankruptcy filing. He emphasized how they'd been deceived about the risks involved and portrayed themselves as victims of Brett's irresponsible behavior rather than acknowledging their role in ignoring obvious warning signs about his financial track record. My mother then presented her financial analysis showing that $25,000 would solve their immediate problem and allow them to move forward with their retirement plans. She'd calculated that this amount represented less than a year's salary for me and argued that it was a reasonable sacrifice to help family members who'd supported me throughout my life. They took turns explaining how much they'd done for me over the years, from paying for my education to helping with my first car purchase. They itemized their contributions and seemed to expect me to reciprocate by covering their losses from Brett's failed investment. The implication was that I owed them financial support regardless of how they'd gotten into their current situation. When they finished their presentation, they looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to agree to their proposal and write a check that would solve their problems. The silence stretched for several minutes as I considered everything they'd said and prepared to give them an answer that would fundamentally change our relationship forever. I told my parents that I understood their financial situation was difficult and that I sympathized with the stress they were experiencing. I acknowledged everything they'd done for me over the years and expressed genuine appreciation for their support during my education and early career development. But then I explained why I wouldn't be contributing any money to resolve their crisis. The answer I gave them was simple and direct. I said, "You made an adult decision to co-sign Brett's loan despite my warnings about his financial irresponsibility. The consequences of that decision are yours to handle, not mine. I will not be paying for mistakes I advised you not to make." My parents' reaction was immediate shock, followed by anger and accusations that I was being heartless and selfish. They couldn't seem to understand that their financial crisis was the result of their own poor judgment rather than an unfortunate accident that required family intervention. They'd expected me to take responsibility for fixing problems I'd explicitly warned them to avoid. I continued by explaining that bailing them out would only enable future poor decisions and would be unfair to me as someone who'd been financially responsible throughout my adult life. I pointed out that I'd worked hard and made sacrifices to build my financial security and that I wasn't willing to risk my own future to cover losses from investments I'd advised against. When my parents argued that family was supposed to help each other, I reminded them that I had tried to help by providing advice about Brett's loan request. They'd chosen to ignore my warnings and proceed with a decision that any objective analysis would have identified as extremely risky. I'd fulfilled my family obligation by offering sound counsel that they'd rejected. My mother started crying and accused me of abandoning them during their time of greatest need. She said she couldn't believe her own son would watch his parents lose their retirement savings over money that wouldn't significantly impact my lifestyle. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that the amount involved represented a substantial portion of my own financial security. My father tried a different approach, arguing that helping them would be an investment in my inheritance, since preserving their retirement savings would ultimately benefit me. I explained that I'd never counted on receiving an inheritance and that making financial decisions based on expected future benefits was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten them into their current situation. The conversation became increasingly heated as my parents realized I was serious about not contributing money to their crisis. They threatened to cut off contact and remove me from there, well, if I didn't reconsider. I told them that those decisions were theirs to make, but that financial threats wouldn't change my position on taking responsibility for their poor judgment. Finally, I stood up to leave and delivered the statement that ended our relationship as they'd known it. I said, "I love you both, but I won't enable irresponsible financial decisions by cleaning up the consequences. You're adults who made an informed choice against good advice. The results are your responsibility to handle." My parents didn't speak to me for 6 months after that conversation. During that time, they had to sell their house to cover the losses from Brett's bankruptcy and move into a smaller apartment. They both returned to work part-time to rebuild their retirement savings and are still dealing with the financial consequences of their decision to trust Brett with their money. Brett continues to pursue various entrepreneurial ventures with the same enthusiasm and poor judgment that characterized his real estate investment. He's never acknowledged responsibility for the financial disaster he created or shown any remorse for the impact on my parents' lives. He treats his bankruptcy as ancient history and continues looking for new opportunities that will make him rich. As for me, I've maintained my financial discipline and continued building toward my own goals without the burden of cleaning up other people's mistakes. My relationship with my parents eventually resumed, but it's different now. They understand that I won't be their financial safety net and that I expect them to take responsibility for their own decisions. The situation taught me that family loyalty doesn't require sacrificing your own financial security to enable other people's poor judgment. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is allow people to experience the natural consequences of their choices rather than protecting them from reality. My parents learned an expensive lesson about the importance of careful financial planning and the dangers of ignoring good advice.